Morning light reached the sanctuary gate as troops and citizens filled the plaza. Mounted units moved in tight formation while people pointed and whispered nearby. Shen Tianzi rode forward on a white mount and accused a vendor of selling primitive beasts. He struck the seller and threatened death in front of the crowd. Observers recorded every movement and noted the rider's link to Qin Xuan. Luo Tianyang laughed and warned that the seller was lucky the troops moved in a rush. Han Sen watched from the edge and called them a gang of assholes. He resolved to raise his power quickly with crystals and wait for the right moment to strike back. 3 days later, Han Sen returned to his sanctuary room. He inspected a caged beast with copper teeth and a bronze-like shell. Han Sen inspected the caged creature and noted its bronze sheen and copper teeth. He concluded the specimen remained far from true mutation and accepted that patience was his only practical option. He planned to hunt primitive beasts for cash. He would gather purity gene points first before attempting more complex evolution. A knock interrupted his routine, and 2 men peered through his door seeking gossip about Windfall Valley. They asked about rumors that many had died there. They said 3 powerhouse fighters had teamed up against a newly discovered God's Blood beast. Han Sen reacted with sharp surprise and listened as the men urged following the hunt to claim any leftovers. The prospect of a God's Blood encounter tightened Han Sen's focus. His resolve to grow stronger felt suddenly urgent. Han Sen had resolved to grow stronger and to gather purity gene points before evolving further. News of a God's Blood beast hunt had considerably sharpened his urgency. Elsewhere, an armored figure climbed the peak beside Sunset Slope and settled to observe. The figure judged the timing acceptable and scanned the valley below carefully. A tall column of dust marked a distant clash far under the sunset sky. 3 elite fighters then burst from cover and ran down the ridge with precise steps. One woman shouted orders, while the others urged everyone to advance without delay. Mounted riders and infantry followed the command and surged toward the dust cloud. The host moved with practiced aggression toward the rumored God's Blood beast. The armored watcher measured the threat and readied for possible imminent intervention. The coming hunt promised danger, opportunity, and fierce competition for any survivor. The God's Blood beast burst from the ridge and pounded into the hunting line. Riders and infantry scattered as the creature's weight crashed through their formation. Spears and arrows glanced off its armor with little lasting effect. A shockwave followed the impact and hurled fighters across the valley floor. Flames and dust rose in a blinding curtain of destruction. The hunters' advance collapsed into chaotic retreats and scattered resistance. The armored figure watched from above and tightened their stance at once. Sweat stood on the observer's brow as recognition flared in their eyes. The observer judged the God's Blood beast to be far stronger than expected. The valley had become a brutal proving ground for any who remained. Tensions spiked among the surviving fighters. The God's Blood beast had burst from the ridge and struck the hunters' formation. Riders and infantry were hurled aside as its weight smashed through their lines. Spears and arrows glanced off its plated armor with little effect. A shockwave followed the impact and flung fighters across the valley floor. Flames and dust rose to form a blinding curtain that hid many figures. Amid the chaos, the beast raised a massive blade and readied a crushing strike. A lone fighter crouched beneath the swing and tried to shield his head. The armored figure watched from above and tightened stance at once. An unknown observer broke into sweat as recognition flared across their eyes. They judged the God's Blood beast far stronger than expected. The valley had become a brutal proving ground for any who remained. The valley filled with dust and rain as fighters braced beneath a lowering sky. A shouted warning of "Dodge it" sent mounted hunters scattering across the plain. The god's blood beast swung a blazing blade and carved a glowing crescent through air. The attack's arc forced two riders high into the wind and threw them off course. Spears and arrows glanced uselessly off plated armor. A hot shockwave collapsed ranks and sent combatants tumbling into grit. Flames and dust rose to a blinding curtain that hid many figures. A lone fighter crouched and covered his head against the blast. The armored figure watched from above and tightened its stance at once. An unknown observer broke into sweat and realized the beast's strength far exceeded expectation. Qin Xuan's eyes widened as the blade's glow bore toward her. The valley had become a brutal proving ground for any who remained. The valley had filled with dust and rain as fighters braced beneath the lowering sky. Mounted hunters scattered after the warning, while the god's blood beast swung its blazing blade. Its crescent strike launched two riders into the wind and threw them off course. A hot blast collapsed ranks and sent fighters tumbling into grit and flame. A lone fighter covered his head against the force of air. The armored figure watched from above and tightened its stance without shifting position. An unknown observer broke into sweat and realized the beast's strength exceeded expectation. Qin Xuan widened her eyes as the blade's glow bore toward her line. A man screamed at his mutated beast soul mount and swore to kill it. His voice cut through the dust and carried urgent anger across the field. The armored figure's helmet framed a pair of calm, focused eyes that watched him. Tension threaded the air as combatants readied for whatever would follow the threat. Rain and dust filled the valley as fighters braced under a lowering sky. The god's blood beast swung a blazing crescent and struck the field with force. Two mounted hunters were torn into the wind and flung from their mounts. A hot blast collapsed ranks and sent combatants tumbling into grit and flame. The armored figure hovered above and watched with calm, focused eyes without movement. An unknown observer broke into a sweat and reassessed the beast's strength. Qin Xuan widened her eyes as the blade bore toward her line. The beast's dominance faltered when a sudden barrage hammered its plated back. Sparks scattered across golden armor, and the monster staggered from the impact. Silence rippled through the ranks as fighters readied for the next threat. Rain and dust filled the valley as fighters braced under a lowering sky. The god's blood beast swung a blazing crescent and struck the field with force. Two mounted hunters were torn into the wind and flung from their mounts. A hot blast collapsed ranks and sent combatants tumbling into grit and flame. The armored figure hovered above and watched with calm, focused eyes without movement. He called the creature sacred rank and admitted its strength far exceeded the beetle he'd killed. An unknown broke into a sweat and reassessed the beast's power nearby. Qin Xuan widened her eyes as the blade bore toward her line. A sudden barrage hammered the beast's plated back and sent sparks across golden armor. The monster staggered, and its dominance faltered under the impact and shock. Silence rippled through the ranks as fighters steadied weapons and readied for more. Rain and dust filled the valley as fighters braced beneath a lowering sky. The god's blood beast had swung a blazing crescent and struck the field with force. Two mounted hunters were torn into the wind and flung from their saddles. A hot blast collapsed ranks and sent combatants tumbling into grit and flame. The armored figure hovered above and watched with calm, focused eyes without movement. He called the creature a sacred rank and admitted its strength exceeded the beetle he'd killed. An unknown broke into a sweat and reassessed the beast's power nearby. Qin Xuan widened her eyes as the blade bore toward her line. A barrage hammered the beast's plated back and sent sparks across golden armor. The monster staggered, and its dominance faltered under the heavy impact. Then the beast turned and fled amid shouted orders and incoming attacks. Soldiers fired across its rear, and tried to surround it as it bounded and crashed into the ground. Green power flared beneath it, signaling a new motion and drawing attention. Silence fell briefly as fighters prepared again. Rain and grit swept the valley as fighters steadied beneath a dark sky. The god's blood beast had cleaved the field with a blazing crescent and sent riders flying. A hot blast had collapsed ranks and thrown combatants into grit and flame. The armored figure hovered above without motion and measured the creature's strength, calling it sacred and noting its power. An unknown reassessed the threat, while Qin Xuan watched the blade bear toward her line. A barrage struck the beast's plated back and staggered it, and the creature retreated amid shouted orders. Green power flared beneath the beast and drew every eye. Silence fell. Then the armored figure thrust his hand, gathered a spiraling green energy, swore at the fleeing target, and launched a spear-like projectile to pursue the retreat. The armored figure's spear left his palm and streaked forward, wrapped in crackling green energy. The attack carried a venomous essence. Observers named it sacred rank Poison Burst 6 Wing Bee's Beast Soul. Qin Xuan listened and calculated the danger with a steady gaze. She noted that people who knew whole armor protection were fewer than 10. She wondered if the soul's effect could be used only once. Green electricity danced along the spear's blade and licked the air. An unknown voice shouted the soul's name to warn allies and confirm classification. Silence tightened after the call as commanders considered responses and counters. Qin Xuan tightened her grip and scanned for armor reactions and weaknesses, while every eye tracked the projectile's flight. The armored figure's spear had left his palm crackling with green energy and bitter venom. Observers identified the effect as a 6-wing bee's sacred poison soul. Qin Xuan had listened and calculated the danger with a steady, practiced gaze. Commanders around her fell silent as they closely tracked the projectile's flight. Then an unknown archer shouted and drew a bowstring, hurling a volley of green arrows into the sky. The arrows cut a channel of light and coalesced into a concentrated beam mid-flight. Eyes followed the streak as it sped rapidly toward the distant ground. The beam struck and raised a cloud of debris and a shockwave across the plain. Qin Xuan tightened her grip and scanned for armor reactions and weaknesses, while commanders considered counters in silence. The armored figure had launched a spear charged with a 6-wing bee poison soul. Commanders and observers tracked its arc while an unknown archer prepared a counter. The archer released a volley that fused into a concentrated green beam mid-flight. The beam slammed into the armored warrior's position and detonated on impact. A burst of corrosive green venom tore through his helmet and armor in a single instant. He grimaced within the helm as the poison ruptured and spattered his face. Blood and green energy sprayed across the plain and scattered debris outward. He staggered, then collapsed, dragging his spear as smoke and gas rose. Qin Xuan held her stance and scanned for armor response and vulnerabilities, while commanders fell silent and readied measured counters. The armored warrior had staggered and fallen after green venom pierced helm and armor. Blood and acidic mist sprayed the plain and scattered debris in all directions. Commanders fell silent and readied measured counters, while Qin Xuan maintained her stance. A white-coated man stepped forward and spoke with thin menace to the crowd. He vowed vengeance for his killed mount and declared he would grant no mercy. Bystanders reacted with awe and called the attack a one-shot instant kill. Qin Xuan's calm broke as surprise and concern tightened her expression briefly. She managed a single word before the man smiled and moved forward. Light traced his motion as something sharp cut through the evening air. The plane braced for the next strike and held under an ominous hush. The golden strike descended from the white-coated man's motion and pierced the ground. Impact opened a black void that swallowed light and sent debris scattering. A red segmented tail emerged and flicked near the fallen helm. The armored figure recoiled and registered shock at the sudden motion. The crowd tightened their silence as the scene sharpened into outcome. A digital panel announced the hunt's success and listed rewards. It named a bloodthirsty berserker as defeated and confirmed a sacred blood beast soul had been obtained. The notice reported one sacred soul beast gained and warned consuming its flesh might grant a sacred gene. Observers held their breaths and waited for any follow-up. Qin Xuan's composure had frayed while the white-coated man kept his thin smile. The golden strike had opened the void and revealed sudden motion beneath the fallen helm. Voices rose into alarm as nearby hunters recoiled and shouted all at once. Armored pursuers lunged toward the light and executed coordinated strikes immediately in unison. An armored figure reached the relic and gripped its blade with force. He announced he'd got his hands on it and clenched the weapon. Without hesitation, the warrior spun and launched the relic like a blazing projectile over the ridge. The object sliced through dust and shadow and flew toward the distant valley. Observers watched its arc in stunned silence and backed away from the pit's edge. Qin Xuan's composure crumbled, while the white-coated man's thin smile did not change. The hunt notice still displayed rewards as the crowd waited for consequences. The golden strike had torn the air and revealed movement beneath the fallen helm. Nearby hunters recoiled as armored pursuers lunged, and an armored figure seized the relic before hurling it like a blazing projectile toward the distant valley. Observers watched the object slice through dust and shadow, while the hunt notice still displayed rewards. Then voices rose as multiple onlookers shouted the name Brother Coin, recognition rippling across the crowd. Faces turned and people backed from the pit's edge. Qin Xuan's calm broke into visible surprise, while the white-coated man's thin smile remained. One man echoed the name in a questioning hush, and the crowd's alarm shifted into tense curiosity, waiting for whatever consequence the thrown relic would bring. The armored figure landed among dust and flames and proclaimed he had seized a sacred beast soul. He laughed and shouted that he had earned a huge reward and power. His boast cut across the square and singled out Shen Tianzi by name. The white-coated man's thin smile vanished, vexation hardened his features into fury. He swore and barked orders, cursing the thief and demanding immediate pursuit. Mounted hunters surged to action as the man summoned his black armor horse. Riders launched themselves down the slope, intent on retrieving the stolen relic. Onlookers recoiled from the pit's edge, alarm and curiosity mingling on their faces. Qin Xuan registered visible surprise while the thrown object continued slicing toward the valley. The scene tightened into a chase, rewards and risk driving every movement forward. The armored figure landed and claimed a sacred beast soul as his prize. His loud boast named Shen Tianzi and triggered visible outrage across the square. Shen Tianzi's thin smile vanished and his features hardened into sudden fury. He cursed the thief and barked orders, demanding immediate pursuit of the relic. Mounted hunters surged into motion and rode down the slope with speed. Beneath the descending warrior, a monstrous head coalesced and exhaled green vapor. Dust rolled through the valley as riders thundered and closed on the target. Shouts pierced the air urging immediate follow-up now and harsher reckoning. Shen Tianzi rode at the vanguard, intent on reclaiming the stolen relic. Onlookers stepped back from the pit edge as the chase tightened. Rewards and danger drove every movement as the hunt rushed downhill. The armored figure felt the stolen axe's weight as he fled downhill through a steady drizzle. He gripped the haft with both hands and staggered with every forced step forward. He thought the axe was heavy, but refused to drop his claimed beast soul. Behind him, mounted hunters surged, driven by Shen Tianzi's orders and hunger for reward. Earlier, a monstrous head had briefly coalesced beneath the descending warrior and exhaled green vapor into the valley. Dust and cloud trailed the riders as they closed along the cracked mountain trail. The armored figure shouted for them to stop and pushed his pace farther downhill despite the burden. Hunters cursed and shouted threats promising death if he did not surrender. Onlookers stepped back from the pit edge as the chase tightened around the ravine. Every rider rode faster, tension and greed guiding each reckless advance. The armored figure ran downhill through a steady drizzle while clutching the stolen axe tightly. He staggered with each forced step and refused to drop his claimed beast soul. He had 8 divine gene points, yet still struggled under the weapon's heavy weight. The hunters closed fast along the cracked mountain trail, dust and cloud trailing behind. They shouted threats and promised death if he failed to surrender or stop. Shen Tianzi's hunger for reward and authority drove the mounted pursuit forward without mercy. Onlookers stepped back from the ravine edge as the chase tightened with every pass. The armored figure felt panic and cold sweat form as capture grew more likely. He shouted for the riders to stop and pushed his pace farther downhill despite burden. Earlier, a monstrous head had briefly coalesced beneath him and exhaled green vapor into the valley. The armored figure had run downhill through a steady drizzle while clutching the stolen axe. He staggered with each forced step and refused to drop his claimed beast soul. He still had 8 divine gene points, but struggled under the weapon's heavy weight. The hunters closed fast along the cracked mountain trail, dust and cloud trailing behind them as they shouted threats and promises of death. Shen Tianzi drove the mounted pursuit forward without mercy. Onlookers stepped back from the ravine edge as the chase tightened with each pass. Earlier, a monstrous head had briefly coalesced beneath him and exhaled green vapor into the valley. He had shouted for the riders to stop and pushed his pace farther downhill despite his burden. At a short ledge, he finally realized he could not run any farther. Sweat beaded across his face, and his breath came ragged. He saw the ending he feared upon entering the sanctuary and braced for capture. The armored figure had run downhill through steady drizzle while clutching the stolen axe. He staggered and refused to drop the claimed beast soul as hunters closed fast along the cracked trail, Shen Tianzi urging the mounted pursuit without mercy. He had glimpsed a monstrous head coalesce beneath him and exhale green vapor into the valley. Sweat beaded across his face, and his breath came ragged as he reached a short ledge and realized he could not run farther. He thought of his mother and Zhao Yan and mouthed an apology, accepting that risking life to steal a monster often led to such consequence. A taunting voice then asked if he wanted to stop. He froze, pupils constricting, eyes burning with fear and calculation, while weighing surrender against one last desperate choice. The armored figure had run downhill through steady drizzle while clutching the stolen axe. He staggered and refused to drop the claimed beast soul as hunters closed fast along the cracked trail. Shen Tianzi had urged the mounted pursuit without mercy. A monstrous head had coalesced beneath him and exhaled green vapor into the valley. Sweat beaded on his face, and his breath came ragged when he reached a short ledge and realized he could not run farther. He thought of his mother and Zhao Yan and mouthed an apology. Rain streaked across the path, and his hands trembled around the axe. A taunting voice asked if he wanted to stop. He froze, pupils constricting, eyes burning with fear and calculation. The voice repeated and asked if he was certain, calling him Zhao Sen, while a speaker's mouth showed behind glinting glasses. He weighed surrender against one last desperate choice and braced for the outcome. The armored figure ran downhill through steady drizzle, clutching the stolen axe. Hunters closed fast along the cracked trail in relentless pursuit. Shen Tianzi urged the mounted riders without mercy. A monstrous head formed beneath him and exhaled green vapor into the valley. He reached a short ledge and realized he could not run farther. Fear and calculation fought across his face as sweat beaded. A voice demanded whether he would stop and called him Zio-sen. The speaker's mouth showed behind glinting glasses, and it taunted him. In that moment, a man with glasses urged a different logic to the boy. He told Zio-sen the place was only a game and ordered him to kill an NPC for quick level gains. The boy shouted Dad, then protested he could not go because monsters surrounded the target. He called going there too dangerous and refused to follow the command. The moment left a brutal choice between survival and obedience on the rain-slick ledge. The armored figure had run downhill through steady drizzle, while hunters closed along the cracked trail. Shen Tianzi had urged the mounted riders without mercy as a monstrous head formed and exhaled green vapor into the valley. The armored figure reached a short ledge and could not run farther. Fear and calculation marked his face. A voice had demanded whether he would stop and called him Zio-sen. The speaker with glinting glasses had taunted him and argued that the place was only a game. Zio-sen had shouted for his father and refused because monsters surrounded the target. On the rain-slick ledge, the choice remained brutal between survival and obedience. Then a man perched above shouted that danger always existed and one could not be a coward. Glowing beasts clawed at the rock below, and the man argued gene evolution was an organism's adventure. Zio-sen tightened his grip on the knife and weighed the order against his life. The armored figure had run downhill through steady drizzle, while hunters closed along the cracked trail. Shen Tianzi had urged the mounted riders without mercy. A monstrous head formed and exhaled green vapor across the valley. The armored figure reached a short ledge and could not run farther. Fear and calculation marked his face. A voice had demanded whether he would stop and called him Zio-sen. The speaker with glinting glasses had taunted him and said the place was a game. Zio-sen had shouted for his father and refused to obey among the monsters. On the rain-slick ledge, the choice remained brutal between survival and obedience. Then Shen Tianzi released his bow and fired a small grenade-tipped arrow. The smoke grenade detonated high, and a white cloud swept down the slope. Smoke hid the valley while beasts climbed, and a lone silhouette watched from rock. The armored figure had run downhill through steady drizzle, while hunters closed along the cracked trail. Shen Tianzi had loosed a grenade-tipped arrow earlier that detonated and sent a white cloud sweeping down the slope. Smoke curled and pooled across the rocks, masking movement and muffling sound. A heavy metal arrow followed and slammed into the soil, its shaft thudding into the ground amid debris. The man on the ledge planted his feet and raised his sword to meet the charging beasts. The creatures lunged through the fog with green eyes and bared teeth. One small beast collapsed on the valley floor, blood staining the wet rock. The hunters continued their approach on higher ground as the lone silhouette watched from a distant rock and weighed the brutal choice that remained. Smoke had rolled along the slope, hiding motion and dulling sound as fighters ran. Hunters pressed from above while the armored figure cut down charging beasts. Blades flashed through the mist and met teeth and claws again and again. One smaller creature fell, blood darkening the rain-soaked rock beneath it. Smoke thinned to reveal bodies scattered across the valley like broken figures. On a high boulder, an exhausted man pulled another to his feet and steadied him. The armored figure stood beside them and scanned the ruined slope below. Rain and smoke measured time while the hunters regrouped on higher ground. From a distant rock, a solitary watcher regarded the choice left to them. Silence tightened as survival and mercy hung in fragile balance between pursuers. Smoke had thinned, and bodies lay scattered across the ruined slope like broken figures. From the mist, an unseen voice insisted that risk was necessary to survive the sanctuary. A blazing golden banner proclaimed, you have leveled up above the rain-soaked rock." A bloodied man with glasses turned and offered harsh counsel about evolving by any means. He smiled as rain streaked his face and words cut through silence. Packs of pale beasts moved in the haze with green eyes glinting. A distant speaker warned Zio Sen that the world's moments mirrored a game's crisis. The hunters held positions on higher ground, while mercy and survival balanced precariously between pursuers. Silence tightened as choices and consequences settled low over the soaked valley. Rain had smeared the slope, and bodies lay broken across the rock. A man with glasses stepped forward and drew two blades to guard the youth. He ordered the boy to become stronger and warned that the father would test him now. Pale beasts crept up the incline, their green eyes bright through the mist. They closed distance, and the threat tightened, while the speaker demanded an instant solution. The youth Zio Sen turned with his jaw set and tried to answer. He opened his mouth, and the single syllable I stalled into silence. On higher ground, the hunters watched without shifting their positions or intervening. Every option carried cost, survival mercy, and the need to evolve balanced intention. Time narrowed and hard choices had to be made under the steady rain. Rain plastered the slope and ruined bodies lay scattered across the stone. A man with glasses stepped forward and drew two blades to shield the youth. He scolded Zio Sen for being too kind and said the boy must take harsher steps to survive. Pale beasts crept up the incline, their green eyes bright through mist as the threat tightened. Zio Sen turned with his jaw set and tried to answer, but his single syllable stalled into silence. The man reminded him the father had tested him before, and this trial differed from a game. He warned the world was crueler than any trial. He insisted many times one could only rely on oneself. Above them, the hunters watched without moving. Choices narrowed under steady rain, and mercy balanced against the cost of survival, leaving no room for hesitation. Rain soaked the slope, and bodies lay scattered across the stone in cold silence. A bespectacled man stepped forward and produced two blades to protect the boy. He rebuked Zio Sen for mercy and urged him to grow harsher in trials. Pale beasts crept up the incline, their green eyes bright through the mist as the threat tightened. Zio Sen tried to answer, but his single syllable stalled into silence under the rain. The man reminded him that the father had tested him before, and this trial differed painfully. He insisted the world was crueler than any game, and one could only rely upon oneself. As the man intercepted a sudden strike aimed at Zio Sen, a blade pierced his side. Blood spattered across his shirt. Zio Sen screamed "Dad," and the hunters watched without moving above. Choices narrowed and mercy weighed against survival, without room for hesitation. Rain had soaked the slope, and bodies lay scattered across the stone in cold silence. A bespectacled man had stepped forward and produced two blades to protect the boy. He had rebuked Zio Sen for mercy and urged him to grow harsher in trials. Pale beasts had crept up the incline, and their green eyes glinted through the mist. As a blade had pierced the man's side, blood spattered across his shirt. Zio Sen had screamed for his father, and the hunters watched unmoving above. Then a golden banner flashed above announcing that he had leveled up. The bespectacled man asked if he had ways to instantly become stronger now. Zio Sen's breath had hitched, his face was bloodied, and his eyes widened. He had closed his eyes and clenched his brow while rain slid down his skin. Choices narrowed to survival or mercy, and the man insisted the world required self-reliance. Silence stretched as the boy faced the demand to trade compassion for strength. Rain had drenched the slope, and bodies lay motionless across wet stone. A bespectacled man had stepped forward and raised two blades to shield Zio Sen, scolding the boy for mercy and urging harsher choices. Pale beasts crept up the incline and green eyes glinted through mist. A blade had torn the man's side, and blood stained his shirt while hunters watched unmoving above. A golden banner had declared a level up, and the man had asked if there were ways to become stronger instantly. Zio Sen's breath had hitched. He had closed his eyes, clenched his brow, and weighed survival against compassion. Then his gaze had flared with sudden resolve. He had seized a method as a real chance, bolted down the slope, and screamed a single furious attack as he charged for escape. Rain soaked the slope, and bodies lay motionless on the black stone. A bespectacled man had stepped forward and raised two blades to shield Zio Sen, scolding the boy. Pale beasts crept up the incline, while green eyes glinted through the mist. The man bled from a torn side as hunters watched unmoving above. Zio Sen weighed survival against compassion and then seized a desperate plan. A white-coated figure leapt down and shouted that the method was risky but his own. The figure abandoned caution and yelled to begin the attack without hesitation. A golden warrior's form flared as a sacred blood chant echoed across the slope. The man fused with a bloodthirsty berserker soul and became armored in blazing gold. Red slashes tore the air as he launched a furious downward counterattack. Rain and smoke still drifted across the slope when the golden form dove. It struck the ground with a column of fire that split the air. Shards of rock and sparks spun outward and swallowed the nearby figures. Through falling ash, a small white-coated man appeared braced against the blast. He staggered backward and shouted in raw disbelief at what he saw. Voices echoed from above as hunters and observers registered impossible strength now. Zio Sen watched, weighing rescue against survival and feeling panic rise inside. Smoke cleared enough to show the golden silhouette standing unresolved amid ruin. He bellowed two raw questions that cracked through rain and ash with tremor. No one could answer. Only the golden figure and the boiling silence remained. Rain and smoke lingered on the slope after the golden form dove and struck with fire. Rocks and sparks spun outward and swallowed nearby figures. Through falling ash, a small white-coated man staggered backward and shouted in disbelief. Hunters and observers registered impossible strength above and remained frozen. Zio Sen watched, balancing rescue against his own survival and feeling panic. Smoke thinned to reveal the golden silhouette standing amid ruined ground. He bellowed two raw questions that echoed across rain and ash with no answer. The figure then descended closer, horns and plated armor catching the dim light as wings of flame unfurled. He gripped a long spear and planted it like a claim. Red text announced fused soul beasts, sacred bloodthirsty berserker, and the black-armored beetle. Silence followed as the field awaited the next move. Rain and smoke lingered as the golden figure landed and drove its spear into the ground. Sparks and fractured stone skittered outward and swallowed small figures in their path. Zio Sen staggered back, torn between rescue and his own survival instincts. Hunters and Peking men stood frozen, registering impossible strength without answer. The armored being laughed and proclaimed the fusion successful, claiming there was always hope in the world. He boasted the double fusion of sacred bloodthirsty berserker and black-armored beetle made him unstoppable. Observers shouted that double soul beast fusion was dangerous and only 10% viable. Some called him a crazy madman for daring to fuse while running. The figure advanced with wings of flame and plated armor catching dim light. Silence stretched across ash and cracked stone as everyone awaited his next move. Smoke and ash still clung to the ground as hunters reacted with fury. They yelled that someone had snatched a sacred beast soul and ordered immediate pursuit. Riders spurred their mounts across jagged rock, each landing leaving fresh craters and torn earth. Explosions flared along the trail where strikes scattered debris and clouded the path. Hunters branded the runner a bandit and demanded capture by any means. One shouted that the figure was not human and must be sliced to pieces. Peking men huddled in cover, tense and silent as the chase sped past them. The armored figure's earlier claim of impossible double fusion hung in memory, and pursuers now sought retribution. A single observer's green eyes widened in fear as the hunt drove toward a violent confrontation. Smoke and ash had still clung to the ground as hunters reacted with fury and ordered pursuit. Riders spurred mounts across jagged rock and left fresh craters and torn earth. Explosions scattered debris along the trail and clouded the path. A leader warned the mountain maze hid the runner from Shen Tianzi and could foil direct tracking. A white-haired observer said the thief had stolen a golden axe and taken a sacred beast soul after stealing the final kill. She mocked Shen Tianzi for a failed one-time soul arrow and laughed at his loss. Hunters traded jeers about wealth and the price of a sacred soul while vowing capture. Peking men stayed hidden and silent. Armored figures' earlier claim of double fusion hung in memory as pursuers sought retribution. An unknown observer watched with widening green eyes as the hunt tightened. Hunters gathered on a ridge and debated the stranger's identity and worth. They traded rumors about a golden axe and a stolen sacred beast soul. One hunter repeated a new nickname, and the group began to call him Brother Beast. Peking men remained hidden on the slopes and watched the conversation unfold. The mountain maze offered cover, and a leader warned the terrain could foil direct tracking. A white-haired observer mocked Shen Tianzi and joked about his failed soul arrow. Elsewhere in a forest hollow, Han Sen tested himself and steadied his hands on earth. He read the fight clock and realized his transformation could only last 7 to 8 minutes. A sign read Forest Horn and Hunters tightened their lines toward the valley. Armored figures' earlier claim of double fusion lingered in some pursuers' memories. An unknown observer watched with widening green eyes as the hunt intensified. Hunters had gathered along the ridge and traded notes about the stranger's value. They recalled a golden axe and a stolen sacred beast soul as rumor spread. A new nickname spread, and several men began calling him Brother B. Peking men kept to the slopes and watched while a leader warned about terrain. In a forest hollow, Han Sen had steadied himself and measured his transformation time. He recalled avoiding a fight with Shen Tianzi because his escape skill had limits.